in the deep heart of Alabama, long after the Civil War had ended and slavery was legally abolished, the story of one man continued to resonate. A story that bridged the horrors of the past with the living memory of a nation still grappling with its legacy. Cudjo Lewis, one of the last known survivors of the transatlantic slave trade, carried with him the echoes of a world that had been violently torn apart. A world that many Americans had long tried to forget. His life was not just a tale of survival, it was a testament to resilience, memory, and the indomitable human spirit. 50 years after the abolition of slavery, his recollections offered a rare, unfiltered window into the brutality, the endurance, and the humanity of those who were brought from Africa to America against their will. This is the story of Cudjo Lewis, the Alabama slave whose memory refused to fade. Cudjo Lewis, born Oluwale Kusala in West Africa around 1841, holds a singular place in history as one of the last known survivors of the transatlantic slave trade. His life story is not merely a biography, it is a living testimony to one of the darkest chapters in human history, a bridge between the brutal reality of the slave trade and the living memory of those who endured it. To understand the significance of Cudjo Lewis, it is essential to examine the circumstances of his early life, the culture and society from which he came, and the events that ultimately led to his forced transportation to the United States. Cudjo was born in what is now Benin, a region that was part of a complex network of African kingdoms and societies with rich traditions, spiritual beliefs, and social structures. He grew up immersed in his community's customs, learning the skills, stories, and values that defined his people. Life for a child like Oluwale was marked by communal bonds, oral traditions, and a deep connection to the land and family, a way of life that would be violently disrupted in a matter of years by the forces of the slave trade. As a young boy, Oluwale witnessed both the beauty and the challenges of his homeland. He learned the practices of farming, fishing, and trade, understanding the rhythms of his village and the interdependence that connected families and neighbors. Religion and spirituality were deeply woven into daily life, and he was initiated into the practices and beliefs of his community, forming a foundation of identity that would later be tested in unimaginable ways. His early life was one of innocence, of learning and growing within a framework of cultural norms and expectations that provided a sense of belonging and purpose. The world he knew was relatively small and intimate, a stark contrast to the horrors that awaited him across the ocean. The disruption came when slavers raided his village, capturing young men, women, and children with ruthless efficiency. Oluwale Kusala, like many others, was forcibly separated from his family, stripped of his freedom, and subjected to a journey that would define the rest of his life. The trauma of capture cannot be overstated. It was not only the physical act of being seized but the psychological terror, the uncertainty, and the immediate loss of everything familiar that marked the beginning in a nightmarish ordeal. Families were torn apart, communities devastated, and a sense of security and identity violently uprooted. For Oluwale, the transition from a life of communal belonging to one of captivity was immediate and absolute, a wrenching shift that would have lasting consequences on his sense of self and his perception of the world. Once captured, Oluwale was transported to the coast, where he and others were held in slave forts or barracoons awaiting shipment across the Atlantic. These holding facilities were places of extreme suffering, overcrowded, unsanitary, and heavily guarded. The enslaved were often kept in chains, fed minimally, and subjected to brutal treatment, all in preparation for the Middle Passage. During this period, Oluwale had to confront not only the physical hardship of confinement, but also the mental anguish of uncertainty and fear. The knowledge that he was about to be transported across an ocean to a land he did not know, where he would be forced to serve strangers, must have been terrifying. This period also served as a final severance from the life and culture he had known, a preparation for the dehumanizing journey. The voyage itself, aboard the Clotilda, was a harrowing ordeal. The Clotilda, which would become infamous as the last known ship to bring enslaved Africans to the United States, transported Oluwale and dozens of others under inhumane conditions. The Middle Passage was marked by overcrowding, disease, starvation, and abuse. People were packed tightly into the ship's hold, chained together with little room to move, breathe, or sleep. Sanitation was virtually non-existent, and the spread of illness was rapid and deadly. Many did not survive the journey, succumbing to disease, despair, or mistreatment. Oluwale's survival through this brutal passage was a testament to his resilience and strength, but it came at a tremendous cost to his physical and emotional well-being. The trauma of the voyage left scars that would last a lifetime, shaping his perception of captivity, freedom, and human cruelty. Upon arrival in Alabama, Oluwale Kusala was sold into slavery, marking the beginning of a new phase of suffering. His life in captivity involved grueling labor on plantations, harsh punishments, and the constant threat of violence. Yet even in the depths of slavery, Olawale retained elements of his identity and cultural heritage. He remembered the language, stories, and customs of his homeland, which helped him maintain a sense of self amidst the relentless dehumanization of the American slave system. He navigated the complex hierarchy of plantation life, observing the dynamics of power between enslaved people and their owners, while forging bonds with others who shared his experience. These relationships, forged in the crucible of suffering, were essential for survival, providing emotional support, knowledge exchange, and occasional opportunities for resistance. Cudjo Lewis's experience was emblematic of the broader transatlantic slave trade, which forcibly transported millions of Africans to the Americas over centuries. His survival made him a living connection to this history, a rare witness who could speak firsthand about the realities of capture, transportation, and slavery. Unlike the majority of those who were enslaved, Olawale lived long enough to recount his experiences, providing historians and the public with invaluable insight into a system that sought to erase identity, culture, and humanity. His narrative offers detailed accounts of life in Africa, the trauma of the Middle Passage, and the daily struggles of enslavement, making his story a cornerstone of historical understanding. The fact that he lived into the 20th century meant that people could hear directly from someone who had experienced the slave trade, rather than relying solely on second-hand accounts or documents, which often lacked the personal depth and emotional truth of lived experience. Over time, Olawale Kosala became widely known by the name Cudjo Lewis, a name that would be recorded in newspapers, books, and interviews. This adaptation of his name reflects the broader process of cultural erasure and adaptation forced upon enslaved Africans, who often had their identities overridden by owners or colonial systems. Despite this, Cudjo retained his memory and sense of heritage, sharing stories of his homeland, his capture, and the journey across the Atlantic. His recollections were preserved in part through the work of journalist and historian Zora Neale Hurston, who recorded his narrative in the. These interviews became a crucial resource for understanding the human dimension of slavery, offering intimate details about the lives of the enslaved, the customs of African societies, and the psychological impact of displacement and oppression. Cudjo Lewis's life after emancipation was marked by resilience and the creation of community. He helped found Africa Town, a settlement near Mobile, Alabama, where freed Africans could live together, preserving elements of their culture and tradition. In this community, Cudjo and others recreated aspects of the social structures, rituals, and language of their homeland, demonstrating remarkable strength and agency in the aftermath of slavery. Africa Town became a living testament to survival and cultural continuity, an enduring legacy of the people who refused to let their heritage be completely extinguished. Through his leadership and memory, Cudjo Lewis ensured that the experiences of those transported on the Clotilda would not be forgotten, providing future generations with a direct connection to the past. Cudjo Lewis's story is not only significant historically but also morally and culturally. His survival reminds the world of the human cost of slavery, and the resilience of those who endured it. He serves as a bridge between the past and the present, illustrating the ways in which memory and testimony can preserve truth in the face of systemic attempts to erase it. By recounting his life experiences, Cudjo challenged the prevailing narratives of his time, which often sought to minimize or romanticize slavery, and he asserted the reality of African humanity, strength, and endurance. His life story compels us to confront uncomfortable truths, to recognize the depth of suffering endured, and to honor the courage of those who survived. After being captured in his West African village, Olawale Kosala, later known as Cudjo Lewis, was forced into a world of unimaginable brutality as he was prepared for transport to the Americas. The journey from Africa to the United States, known as the Middle Passage, was one of the most horrific experiences in human history, and Cudjo's story offers an unfiltered glimpse into its cruelty and terror. Following his capture, he was marched with other captives to the coast, a grueling trek that often lasted days or weeks, through landscapes that were once familiar to him but now became the backdrop of fear and despair. These forced marches were designed to weaken the captives, to break their spirits, and to prevent rebellion. Those who faltered or resisted were often beaten or killed, leaving survivors to internalize both physical pain and the psychological weight of helplessness. Once at the coast, Cudjo and the other captives were confined in slave forts or barracoons, essentially holding pens built to store human beings before their shipment across the ocean. These structures were crowded, unsanitary, and heavily guarded. Families and communities were further torn apart as individuals were separated, sometimes permanently, from loved ones. Within these walls, captives faced starvation, disease, and abuse, with little opportunity to rest or recuperate from the trauma of capture and forced march. The conditions were deliberately dehumanizing, meant to strip people of their identity and reduce them to commodities for sale in the transatlantic slave trade. Cudjo's memories of this period later reflected the constant fear, the struggle for survival, and the small acts of resistance or solidarity that offered glimmers of hope amidst the horror. The next phase of Cudjo's ordeal was the transatlantic voyage aboard the Clotilda, the last known ship to illegally transport enslaved Africans to the United States. The Clotilda's journey was emblematic of the Middle Passage, with captives crammed into the hold under inhumane conditions. The enslaved were chained together, packed tightly, and given minimal food and water, often of poor quality. Disease spread quickly in the cramped and unsanitary environment, and many perished during the journey. For those who survived, the psychological trauma of witnessing death, suffering, and the constant threat of violence left enduring scars. Cudjo Lewis's survival of this passage was a testament not only to his physical resilience, but also to his mental endurance, as he endured unimaginable conditions while witnessing the suffering of countless others around him. The Clotilda's voyage was made even more harrowing by the secrecy and illegality surrounding it. By the time it transported Cudjo and others, the transatlantic slave trade had been outlawed in the United States, making this journey a criminal enterprise. The ship's captain and crew took extreme measures to evade authorities, burning records and attempting to cover evidence of their crime. For the captives, however, the legality or illegality of the voyage mattered little. They were subjected to the same brutal treatment regardless. Cudjo's later recollections highlighted both the dehumanizing physical conditions and the psychological torment of being treated as property, emphasizing how the captives were rendered invisible in the eyes of those profiting from their enslavement. During the voyage, the captives' cultural identities were constantly threatened. Language, religion, and social customs were suppressed as captives were forced into silence and obedience. Yet many, including Cudjo, retained fragments of their heritage, remembering songs, prayers, and rituals from home. These memories became acts of resistance, small ways to maintain a sense of identity and humanity amidst systematic dehumanization. Cudjo's later storytelling preserved details of African life and customs, providing a unique historical record that would otherwise have been lost. His recollections of the Middle Passage were not only about physical suffering but also about the cultural erasure imposed by slavery and the resilience required to preserve one's sense of self. Upon reaching Mobile, Alabama, Cudjo and the other captives were sold to plantation owners, entering a system of bondage that would dominate their lives for decades. The transition from the Middle Passage to plantation slavery did not diminish the brutality of their circumstances. It merely shifted the environment in which the oppression occurred. Plantation life was marked by grueling labor, harsh discipline, and the constant threat of violence. Cudjo, like others, had to learn quickly how to navigate the social hierarchies imposed by slave owners, balancing the need to survive with the desire to maintain dignity and cultural identity. The trauma of the Middle Passage was compounded by the new realities of forced labor, exploitation, and the absence of family and community networks that had previously provided support and stability. Cudjo Lewis's experiences during this period were shaped by both oppression and the small acts of autonomy that enslaved people could claim. Work routines were brutal, often beginning before dawn and lasting until sunset, with tasks including field labor, domestic service, and other forms of forced toil. Punishments for perceived infractions could be severe, ranging from physical beatings to other forms of humiliation and control. Despite this, enslaved individuals like Cudjo found ways to assert agency, whether through cultural practices, language retention, or forming bonds with fellow captives. These acts of resilience were vital for survival, offering psychological sustenance and reinforcing a sense of community even in conditions designed to erase individuality. Over time, Cudjo Lewis adapted to the harsh realities of plantation life while holding on to memories of his homeland. He recalled details of his village, the ceremonies and rituals of his people, and the language and customs that connected him to Africa. These memories became a source of strength, a reminder of a life that slavery could not entirely erase. His recollections later became essential historical records, providing insight into African societies before enslavement and the human impact of the transatlantic slave trade. Through his storytelling, Cudjo offered future generations an unfiltered perspective on the experiences of those who endured capture, transportation, and bondage, ensuring that the realities of slavery would not be forgotten. Cudjo's survival and eventual recounting of his experiences were also significant because they occurred during a time when many Americans sought to forget or minimize the horrors of slavery. 50 years after the abolition of slavery, Cudjo's voice provided a living link to a past that many preferred to ignore. His testimony revealed not only the physical and psychological suffering he endured but also the resilience, courage, and humanity of those enslaved. In preserving his story, historians and journalists,
including Zora Neale Hurston, were able to capture a level of detail and emotional truth that documents and records alone could not convey. Cudjo Lewis became more than a survivor. He became a witness, a storyteller and a custodian of memory, ensuring that the world would never entirely forget the realities of the transatlantic slave trade. Cudjo's later life in Africatown, the community he helped establish after emancipation, was deeply informed by his experiences during capture and the Middle Passage. Africatown became a place where former captives and their descendants could maintain elements of African culture, language and social structure. Cudjo's leadership and knowledge were crucial in preserving these traditions, offering continuity and a sense of identity in a society that had sought to erase their origin. The community he helped build stands as a testament to survival, resilience and the determination to preserve history and culture, despite centuries of oppression. Through Africatown, the memory of Cudjo Lewis and the others who endured the Clotilda voyage remained alive, offering future generations a tangible connection to the past. Cudjo Lewis's life story, beginning with his capture and forced transportation, illustrates the full arc of the transatlantic slave experience, from freedom in Africa to enslavement in America, and eventual survival and testimony. His narrative provides an essential lens through which to understand the human impact of slavery, the cultural destruction it wrought, and the resilience of those who endured it. By recounting his experiences decades after emancipation, Cudjo Lewis ensured that the personal and collective history of the enslaved would survive, giving voice to those who could not speak for themselves, and reminding the world of the profound human cost of the transatlantic slave trade. The Clotilda, the ship that transported Cudjo Lewis and other captured Africans to the United States, holds a notorious place in the history of the transatlantic slave trade as the last documented vessel to illegally bring enslaved people to American shores. Its voyage is central to understanding not only the story of Cudjo Lewis but also the persistence of the slave trade even after it had been outlawed. By the time the Clotilda set sail, the United States had passed legislation banning the importation of enslaved Africans in 1808. Yet the demand for enslaved labor in the South continued to be high. Plantation owners in Alabama and elsewhere were willing to engage in clandestine and illegal operations to meet their labor needs, reflecting the entrenched economic and social systems built on slavery. The Clotilda represents this criminal persistence, a final act in a centuries-long system that sought to exploit human beings for profit, regardless of the law or morality. Cudjo Lewis and the other Africans who were loaded onto the Clotilda had already endured unimaginable trauma before setting foot on the ship. They had been captured in West Africa, forcibly separated from families and communities, marched to the coast under brutal conditions, and confined in slave barracoons where disease, starvation, and despair were constant companions. When the Clotilda departed, it carried with it not just human cargo but the cumulative suffering of an entire journey marked by violence and loss. The captives were packed into the ship's hold, shackled together, and subjected to the extreme overcrowding that characterized the Middle Passage. The space allotted for each person was minimal, barely enough to sit or lie down, and movement was restricted to prevent rebellion or escape. The physical confinement itself was agonizing, compounded by the oppressive heat, poor ventilation, and stench that permeated the hold, creating conditions ripe for disease and death. The Clotilda's crew demonstrated the ruthless efficiency with which enslaved people were treated as commodities rather than human beings. Captives were counted, inspected, and chained in ways designed to maximize control and minimize escape, with little regard for their health, comfort, or dignity. Food and water were rationed sparingly, often insufficient to sustain the captives' physical needs over the long journey. Those who fell ill were left to suffer in close quarters with others, spreading disease and death. Many perished on the voyage, and the survivors were left to witness the suffering of friends and family members, deepening the psychological trauma. For Cudjo Lewis, enduring this voyage required extraordinary resilience, both physically and mentally, as he navigated an environment that sought to strip him of autonomy, identity, and hope. The Clotilda's journey was further complicated by the need for secrecy. Its voyage was illegal, and the captain and owners went to great lengths to evade authorities. Records were falsified or destroyed, and the ship itself was eventually scuttled to hide evidence of the crime. For the captives, these clandestine efforts were largely invisible. They experienced the same conditions of suffering regardless of legality. Yet the secrecy adds an additional layer to the story, highlighting the lengths to which those profiting from slavery would go to circumvent laws intended to prevent human trafficking. The voyage of the Clotilda underscores the entrenched economic incentives and social acceptance of slavery in the South, revealing a society willing to flout national law for the sake of continued exploitation. During the voyage, Cudjo Lewis and the other captives faced the constant threat of violence and punishment. Rebellion on slave ships was not uncommon, and crews were acutely aware of the dangers posed by desperate confined people. Captives were subjected to intimidation, beatings and other forms of coercion to maintain order. The psychological toll of living under constant threat cannot be overstated. Captives had to navigate fear and uncertainty, witnessing cruelty inflicted upon themselves and others while trying to preserve a sense of self and dignity. For Cudjo, surviving the Clotilda was not only a matter of enduring physical hardships, but also maintaining the mental fortitude to withstand the trauma of oppression and the loss of familiar social and cultural structure. Despite the dehumanizing conditions, captives like Cudjo Lewis found ways to retain elements of their culture and humanity. Oral traditions, songs, prayers and memories of African life were quietly preserved among the group, creating a fragile cultural continuity in the midst of forced displacement. These acts of cultural retention were forms of resistance, affirming identity and community in an environment designed to erase both. For Cudjo, remembering his homeland, the stories of his family and the rituals of his people provided a psychological anchor, a source of strength and continuity that would sustain him through the horrors of enslavement. This retention of identity would later become crucial when Cudjo recounted his experiences decades after emancipation, providing historians and the public with rare, first-hand insights into African life in the transatlantic slave trade. Upon arrival in Mobile, Alabama, the human cargo of the Clotilda was sold to plantation owners, entering a system of bondage that would define their lives for decades. The arrival of Cudjo Lewis and the other Africans marked the beginning of a new chapter of suffering and adaptation. Plantation slavery was physically demanding, psychologically oppressive, and socially isolating. Captives had to navigate rigid hierarchies, harsh discipline and the constant threat of violence, while attempting to preserve their sense of identity and humanity. Cudjo's experiences on the Clotilda directly influenced his ability to survive and adapt to these conditions, as he had already endured extreme adversity and developed resilience and coping strategies that would carry him through decades of bondage. The Clotilda's legacy extends beyond the immediate experiences of its captives. It represents a final, illegal act in a long history of human trafficking, an enduring symbol of the brutality of the transatlantic slave trade. For historians, the ship and its voyage provide crucial evidence of the persistence of slavery even after it was legally prohibited, shedding light on the economic, social and cultural factors that allowed such practices to continue. For descendants in communities like Africatown, founded by survivors of the Clotilda, the ship represents both trauma and survival, a tangible link to the past that shaped their history and identity. The story of the Clotilda and its captives remains a vital reminder of the human cost of slavery, emphasizing the resilience and endurance of those who survived its horror. Cudjo Lewis's recollections of the Clotilda, recorded decades later, offer a rare and invaluable perspective on this historical moment. Unlike archival records or second-hand accounts, Cudjo's narrative provides intimate detail about the experiences of individuals during capture, transport and arrival in the United States. He described not only the physical conditions of the ship, but also the emotional and psychological impact of the journey, the interactions among captives and the coping mechanisms that allowed them to endure. His testimony preserves the memory of a generation whose experiences might otherwise have been lost, giving voice to those who were silenced by history. Through his storytelling, the horrors of the Clotilda become tangible, humanized and impossible to ignore. The Clotilda's story is inseparable from the broader history of the transatlantic slave trade and its impact on the United States. Its voyage highlights the illegal yet persistent efforts to maintain slavery in defiance of national law, reflecting the economic motivations and societal acceptance that underpinned the system. Cudjo Lewis's survival and testimony transformed the Clotilda from a historical artifact into a living narrative of human endurance, cultural preservation and moral reckoning. By recounting his experiences, he ensured that the vessel's legacy would not be reduced to a footnote in history but recognized as a critical chapter in the story of slavery, resilience and the struggle for freedom. Cudjo Lewis's connection to the Clotilda also underscores the importance of community and memory in the aftermath of slavery. After emancipation, he and other survivors established Africatown near Mobile, Alabama, recreating aspects of their African heritage and social organization. The experiences endured on the Clotilda informed the community's cohesion, values and traditions, demonstrating the profound impact of survival and memory on collective identity. Through Africatown, the story of the Clotilda lived on, influencing generations and preserving a tangible link to the past. Cudjo Lewis, as a survivor and storyteller, became a guardian of this history, ensuring that the ship's story and the experiences of those aboard would continue to resonate and educate long after slavery had ended.
After surviving the harrowing voyage aboard the Cudjo, Cudjo Lewis faced the harsh realities of life in Alabama as a newly enslaved person in the American South. The transition from the Middle Passage to plantation slavery was abrupt, marked by relentless labor, brutal discipline, and the constant erosion of personal autonomy. For Cudjo, this period represented not just a continuation of physical suffering but the beginning of a complex and deeply challenging struggle to survive while maintaining a sense of identity and dignity. The plantation system was designed to extract maximum labor from enslaved people while minimizing their humanity, and Cudjo's experiences illustrate both the cruelty of this system and the resilience required to endure it. Upon arrival, Cudjo Lewis was sold to a plantation owner in Alabama, separated from others who had been captured with him. The sale process itself was deeply traumatic, reducing human beings to property, assigning them monetary value, and severing any remaining connections to family or community. For Cudjo, this was yet another moment of profound loss and disorientation as he faced a new environment dominated by strangers and a system designed to control and exploit him. Plantations were sprawling operations where enslaved people were subjected to long hours of grueling labor, often from dawn to dusk in the fields, performing back-breaking tasks such as planting, tending, and harvesting crops like cotton and sugar. The work was physically demanding, and the conditions in which it was carried out, exposed to extreme heat, pests, and inadequate nutrition, made survival itself a daily struggle. Punishment and control were central to the plantation system. Enslaved people were subjected to physical beatings, public shaming, and other forms of violence intended to enforce obedience and suppress resistance. For Cudjo Lewis, navigating these dynamics required both caution and ingenuity. He had to learn how to anticipate the moods and expectations of overseers, understand the power structures within the plantation, and form alliances with other enslaved people to protect himself and maintain some semblance of autonomy. The psychological strain of constant surveillance and threat of punishment weighed heavily, yet Cudjo, like many others, developed resilient strategies to endure. These strategies included forming community bonds, preserving aspects of African culture, and finding subtle ways to assert individuality in a system designed to erase it. Life on the plantation also forced Cudjo to confront the realities of social hierarchy among enslaved people. Those who were skilled laborers, domestics, or who had been with the plantation for longer periods often occupied positions of relative privilege, while newcomers or those assigned the most grueling tasks faced harsher treatment. Cudjo had to navigate these internal hierarchies, understanding how to balance cooperation with self-preservation. Relationships among enslaved people were often complicated by competition for resources, attention from overseers, and the ever-present threat of family separation. Yet within these constraints, bonds were formed that provided essential support, emotional resilience, and a sense of community. Cudjo's ability to cultivate these relationships was critical to his survival and later enabled him to share his story with clarity and depth. The trauma of displacement and enslavement did not erase Cudjo's memory of Africa. He retained knowledge of language, customs, and spiritual practices from his homeland, which became sources of identity and strength in the face of oppression. While the plantation environment sought to suppress cultural expression, Cudjo and others found ways to preserve it through storytelling, song, ritual, and communal practices. These acts were small yet powerful forms of resistance, allowing enslaved people to maintain a connection to their origins and affirm their humanity. Cudjo's later recollections of plantation life included vivid details about these cultural practices, highlighting their importance in sustaining hope and resilience during decades of bondage. Cudjo Lewis's experiences also demonstrate the intersections of labor exploitation and survival in the plantation system. Enslaved people were often forced to work from an early age, learning skills that were useful to the plantation but leaving little time for rest or personal development. Cudjo had to adapt quickly, learning the routines, expectations, and survival strategies necessary to endure long hours of labor while protecting himself from injury, illness, or punishment. The work was exhausting and relentless, yet he and others found moments of respite, whether through brief interactions with peers, communal meals, or private reflection. These moments, though fleeting, were vital for maintaining a sense of self in a system designed to strip it away. The psychological impact of plantation slavery on Cudjo Lewis was profound. Witnessing the suffering, death, and exploitation of others reinforced the harsh reality of his circumstance. At the same time, he had to navigate his own grief, fear, and anger, while remaining physically capable and mentally alert. This dual challenge, enduring physical hardship while managing emotional trauma, required extraordinary resilience. Cudjo's ability to survive for decades under such conditions is a testament to his strength, adaptability, and determination. His later storytelling emphasizes both the brutality of plantation life and the resourcefulness and courage of those who endured it, providing a nuanced account of survival under oppression. Even within the confines of enslavement, Cudjo Lewis displayed remarkable agency. He learned to manage tasks efficiently, negotiate relationships, and preserve elements of his cultural identity. Over time, he became a respected figure within the enslaved community, someone whose knowledge of African customs and experience navigating captivity offered guidance and reassurance to others. These forms of informal leadership and cultural preservation were critical not only for immediate survival but also for laying the groundwork for post-emancipation community building as seen in Africa Town. Plantation life also exposed Cudjo to the wider societal dynamics of the American South, including the economic, political, and cultural structures that reinforced slavery. He observed firsthand the dependence of Southern agriculture on forced labor, the complicity of white society in perpetuating violence, and the systemic mechanisms that ensured compliance and suppressed resistance. This exposure provided him with a deep understanding of the machinery of oppression, knowledge that would later inform his storytelling and serve as a historical record of the lived realities of slavery in Alabama. His experiences illustrate that slavery was not only a physical condition but also a complex social system designed to maintain control through fear, coercion, and cultural erasure. Despite these challenges, Cudjo Lewis's life on the plantation was not devoid of human connection. Bonds with other enslaved people provided emotional support, practical assistance, and a sense of shared experience. These relationships were essential for coping with the harsh conditions and for sustaining morale. Shared memories, cultural practices, and communal solidarity became lifelines that reinforced resilience and allowed individuals like Cudjo to maintain a sense of identity and purpose. These connections also fostered the preservation of African traditions, creating continuity across generations and bridging the gap between life in Africa and survival in the American South. Cudjo Lewis's experiences on the plantation exemplify the broader realities faced by countless enslaved people in the American South. The combination of grueling labor, violence, social hierarchy, and cultural suppression created an environment of constant struggle, yet the resilience and resourcefulness of individuals allowed them to survive and preserve elements of their humanity. Cudjo's survival, adaptation, and eventual recounting of his experiences offer a rare and invaluable insight into the lived realities of slavery, highlighting both the cruelty of the system and the extraordinary endurance of those who endured it. Through his decades on Alabama plantations, Cudjo Lewis emerged, not just as a survivor but as a repository of memory and culture, preserving knowledge of African life, the traumas of enslavement, and the strategies of resilience that sustained him. His experiences illustrate the intersection of suffering, identity, and survival, providing a foundation for understanding both the human cost of slavery and the extraordinary capacity for endurance that defined those who lived through it. By recounting these experiences later in life, Cudjo ensured that the harsh realities of plantation slavery would be remembered, offering future generations an unfiltered view of what it meant to endure bondage while preserving identity, culture, and dignity. After the end of the Civil War and the legal abolition of slavery in the United States, Cudjo Lewis, like millions of other formerly enslaved people, faced the daunting challenge of building a life in freedom. Emancipation did not automatically bring security, wealth, or acceptance. Instead, it left individuals to navigate a society that was often hostile, discriminatory, and unprepared to integrate people who had been enslaved for generations. For Cudjo Lewis, survival and freedom meant both practical adaptation and the preservation of cultural identity. One of his most significant contributions during this period was helping to establish Africa Town, a community near Moby, Alabama, where former captives from the Clotilda and their descendants could live together, preserving elements of their African heritage and forging a collective identity rooted in resilience and autonomy. Africa Town represented more than just a place to live. It was an experiment in cultural preservation and self-determination. The community was built by people who had endured unspeakable suffering and who were determined to maintain connections to their homeland and tradition. Cudjo Lewis and others drew upon memories of life in Africa to recreate social structures, communal norms, and cultural practices. They named streets, organized social gatherings, and maintained rituals that reflected African customs, ensuring that the horrors of enslavement did not erase their heritage. For Cudjo, Africa Town was both a refuge and a statement, a declaration that African identity, culture, and community could survive even in the face of centuries of oppression. The establishment of Africa Town required considerable effort and resilience. The community was built on land that had to be purchased, cleared, and developed often under conditions of economic hardship and systemic discrimination. Freed people faced barriers to employment, legal recognition, and access to resources, yet they persevered, leveraging communal labor skills and knowledge to create a functioning settlement. Cudjo Lewis, with his first-hand experience of African society and his leadership within the group of Clotilda survivors, played a central role in guiding the community. His knowledge of social organization,
traditions and communal responsibility informed the ways in which Africatown was structured, helping to ensure both cohesion and cultural continuity. Life in Africatown was not without challenge. Residents had to navigate a post-emancipation society that was still deeply segregated and discriminatory. Economic opportunities were limited, access to education and healthcare was uneven, and the lingering legacies of slavery imposed psychological and social barriers. Despite these obstacles, Africatown thrived as a community rooted in mutual support, shared history and collective identity. Cudjo Lewis's leadership and storytelling helped reinforce these bonds, reminding residents of their shared experiences and the strength derived from surviving adversity. Through oral histories, communal gatherings and personal example, Cudjo and his peers ensured that Africatown remained a place where memory, culture and resilience were actively preserved. Cudjo's role in Africatown also illustrates the ways in which formerly enslaved people navigated the transition from bondage to freedom. Freedom was not simply the absence of chains, it required active participation in rebuilding life, creating social structures and negotiating the hostile environment of the American South. For Cudjo, this meant balancing practical concerns, such as housing, work and security, with the preservation of identity and cultural heritage. Africatown became a microcosm of this broader struggle, demonstrating how formerly enslaved Africans could assert agency, create cohesive communities and maintain connections to their ancestral past, despite systemic oppression and societal marginalization. One of the most remarkable aspects of Africatown was its commitment to cultural continuity. Residents retained elements of African language, religious practices and social customs, often blending them with new practices adapted to the context of the American South. Cudjo Lewis, as one of the elders and survivors of the Clotilda, served as a repository of memory and knowledge, transmitting stories, rituals, and values to younger generations. This intergenerational transmission was vital in preserving the community's unique identity, ensuring that the experiences of the Clotilda survivors remained alive in the collective consciousness of Africatown. Cudjo's recollections also provided historians and the broader public with an invaluable first-hand account of both African life before enslavement and the realities of the transatlantic slave trade. The creation of Africatown also reflected a broader psychological need for agency and self-determination. After decades of being controlled, commodified and dehumanized, the residents of Africatown sought to reclaim control over their lives and destiny. By establishing a self-sustaining community, they created a space where they could govern themselves, make decisions collectively and live according to their values and traditions. For Cudjo Lewis, this act of building a community was both practical and symbolic, demonstrating that freedom could be exercised in meaningful ways despite systemic obstacles. It was an affirmation of resilience, a reclamation of identity and a testament to the enduring human spirit. In addition to cultural preservation, Africatown provided practical support and mutual aid for its residents. Communities formed around shared labor, cooperative farming, trade and childcare, creating a safety net in a society that often denied access to formal economic and social resources. Cudjo Lewis and other leaders helped coordinate these efforts, ensuring that residents could meet their basic needs while also fostering a sense of unity and purpose. These communal structures reflected both African traditions and adaptations to the American context, highlighting the ingenuity and resourcefulness of the Clotilda survivors. The success of Africatown, despite limited resources and systemic discrimination, underscores the capacity for formerly enslaved people to create thriving, self-sufficient communities when given the opportunity. Cudjo Lewis's personal contributions to Africatown extended beyond leadership and cultural preservation. He also became a living symbol of survival and resilience. His presence, memory and testimony served as constant reminders of the community's origins and the extraordinary hardships endured by its founders. Through storytelling, he transmitted not only the facts of history but also the emotional and moral lessons embedded in those experiences. Residents of Africatown and later generations could draw strength from his example, understanding that endurance, adaptability and solidarity were essential tools for survival and progress in the post-emancipation era. The historical significance of Africatown and Cudjo Lewis's role in its establishment cannot be overstated. The community stands as one of the few living legacies of the transatlantic slave trade in the United States, preserving the culture, history and memory of Africans who were forcibly brought to America. Through Africatown, the experiences of Cudjo Lewis and the other Clotilda survivors were documented not only in stories and oral histories but also in the physical landscape, streets and homes they built. This tangible preservation of history allows contemporary society to engage with the realities of slavery, the resilience of survivors, and the enduring impact of African heritage in America. Cudjo Lewis's story in Africatown also highlights the intersection of memory, history and identity. By maintaining connections to African customs, community cohesion and collective memory. He ensured that the horrors of enslavement would not erase the cultural richness of his people. His leadership demonstrates how formerly enslaved individuals could exercise agency in shaping their post-emancipation lives, creating spaces where culture, history and survival intersected. Africatown became a beacon of resilience, illustrating the ways in which memory and community could counteract the dehumanizing effects of slavery while fostering continuity, pride and self-determination. Cudjo Lewis's role in establishing and sustaining Africatown also provided a platform for his later storytelling, including interviews with historians and journalists who recorded his recollections of the Clotilda, African life and plantation slavery. His first-hand accounts offered an unparalleled window into the transatlantic slave trade, providing depth, nuance and emotional resonance that written records alone could not capture. Through Africatown, Cudjo's experiences became embedded in a living community, ensuring that the lessons of history, the memory of suffering and the triumph of survival remained accessible and relevant to future generations. 50 years after the abolition of slavery in the United States, Cudjo Lewis became a rare and invaluable voice, providing first-hand accounts of one of history's darkest chapters. While many narratives of slavery were filtered through the perspectives of white writers, official documents or second-hand testimonies, Cudjo's recollections offered an unmediated glimpse into the lived experience of enslavement, the Middle Passage, and life in Africa prior to capture. His memories were preserved in interviews conducted in the 1920s by journalists and anthropologists, most notably Zora Neale Hurston, who recognized the importance of recording the stories of surviving Clotilda captives. These interviews captured not only the events of his life but also the emotional weight, cultural context, and resilience embedded in his experience. Cudjo Lewis's voice became a bridge between the past and the present, a living connection to the human realities behind historical records and statistics. When Cudjo began sharing his story, the world had largely moved on from slavery, viewing it as a distant and closed chapter in American history. Yet his recollections challenged this complacency, revealing the deep and enduring scars that slavery left on individuals, families and communities. He spoke of the capture in his West African village, the violent separation from his family and the terror of the Middle Passage aboard the Clotilda. Through his memories, listeners were transported back to the forced marches to the coast, the crowded barracoons where captives awaited shipment, and the nightmarish voyage across the Atlantic. The details he provided, the stench, the heat, the sound of chains, the fear and the suffering were vivid and visceral, forcing audiences to confront the realities of a system that sought to dehumanize millions. Cudjo's recollections were particularly significant because they offered a perspective that combined both African and American contexts. He remembered the social structures, spiritual practices and cultural norms of his homeland, providing insight into a world that had been violently disrupted by the transatlantic slave trade. These memories allowed historians to understand not only the brutality of enslavement, but also the richness of the cultures that were nearly obliterated by it. Cudjo's stories highlighted how enslaved Africans retained aspects of their identity, language and customs despite the systemic efforts to erase them. In his narratives, the contrast between life in Africa and life in bondage emphasized the profound loss experienced by those who were forcibly removed from their homes. Life in Alabama as an enslaved person was marked by relentless labor, violence and social hierarchies imposed by slave owners and overseers. Cudjo described the daily routines on plantations, from fieldwork at dawn to exhausting labor until sunset, as well as the punishments meted out for perceived infractions. He recounted the fear, discipline and strategies of survival that were necessary to endure these conditions. Yet even within this oppressive system, he and others found ways to preserve human dignity, forge relationships and maintain cultural practices. These acts of resilience and adaptation were central to his story, illustrating the complex interplay between oppression and survival. Cudjo's ability to retain memories of African life while navigating decades of enslavement speaks to the enduring strength of his identity and spirit. By sharing his experiences decades after emancipation, Cudjo Lewis also highlighted the long-term psychological and social effects of slavery. He spoke of the trauma of losing family members, the constant threat of violence, and the enduring pain of displacement. These accounts were not merely historical anecdotes, they were testimonies of lived experience that underscored the human cost of slavery. For audiences in the early 20th century, many of whom had never encountered a living person who had survived the transatlantic slave trade, Cudjo's narrative was both shocking and enlightening. It offered a direct personal window into a past that was often sanitized or romanticized in public discourse. His recollections forced listeners and readers to confront the realities of slavery in a deeply personal and empathetic way. Cudjo's storytelling also emphasized the importance of memory and oral history in preserving culture and identity. Unlike written records which were often created by outsiders or focused on economic and legal details, his narratives captured the human experience, the emotions, relationships, and cultural nuances that defined his life. He described songs, rituals, and customs from his African homeland, as well as communal practices that emerged among the enslaved to sustain morale and solidarity. These oral histories provided a cultural continuity that would have otherwise been lost and offered future generations a rich, nuanced understanding of African heritage and the ways it survived through slavery. Cudjo's memories became not only historical evidence but also a means of cultural preservation, ensuring that the human dimension of the transatlantic slave trade was not erased. The documentation of Cudjo Lewis's accounts in the 1920s was particularly significant, because it occurred during a period when African American voices were systematically marginalized in historical narrative. His interviews allowed him to assert authority over his own story, offering a perspective that challenged prevailing myths and assumptions about slavery. He did not merely recount events, he conveyed the emotional and psychological realities of life as an enslaved person and the strength required to endure decades of oppression. His testimony also highlighted the resilience and resourcefulness of formerly enslaved Africans, emphasizing their agency in preserving culture, establishing communities, and asserting identity in the aftermath of slavery. Cudjo's recollections extended beyond his personal experiences to broader reflections on the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade. He described the social, economic, and cultural upheavals caused by the forced migration of millions of Africans, illustrating how slavery disrupted families, communities, and society. His narrative provided insight into the enduring consequences of slavery, including the challenges faced by freed people in building lives, creating communities, and preserving cultural identity in the American South. By documenting these experiences, Cudjo Lewis contributed to a more complete and humanized understanding of history, one that accounted for the voices and perspectives of those who had been silenced for centuries. The impact of Cudjo Lewis's storytelling was amplified by the recording of his recollections in Africatown, the community he helped establish with other Clotilda survivors. Africatown became a living repository of memory, culture, and resilience, a place where Cudjo's experiences could be shared, preserved, and contextualized within a broader communal history. His role as both a survivor and a storyteller ensured that the lessons of history were actively transmitted to younger generations, providing a tangible connection to African heritage and the transatlantic slave trade. Through Africatown, his memories were embedded not only in narrative but also in the social and physical landscape, creating a multidimensional legacy that continues to educate and inspire. Cudjo Lewis's accounts remain essential to historical scholarship, offering rare and direct testimony about the final chapter of the transatlantic slave trade. He illuminated the brutality of capture, transportation, and enslavement, while also highlighting the resilience, agency, and cultural continuity of African people in the face of oppression. His memories provide a vivid and emotionally compelling record that complements written documentation, revealing the human experience behind historical statistics. By recounting his life 50 years after slavery was abolished, Cudjo Lewis ensured that the story of the Clotilda, the Middle Passage, and African survival in America would endure, serving as a critical reminder of the costs of slavery and the strength of the human spirit. Through his first-hand accounts, Cudjo Lewis transformed abstract history into lived experience, bridging the gap between past and present. His storytelling preserved not only the factual events of his life, but also the emotional, cultural, and moral dimensions of the enslaved experience. 50 years after abolition, his voice carried the weight of memory, bearing witness to centuries of oppression while celebrating survival, community, and cultural continuity. Cudjo Lewis became more than a survivor. He became a historian, a custodian of memory, and a conduit through which the realities of slavery could be understood, remembered, and honored.
Cudjo Lewis's memories of his African homeland offer a rare and invaluable perspective on life in West Africa before the devastating impact of the transatlantic slave trade. Born Oluwale Kasola around 1841 in the region that is now part of Benin, he grew up in a society rich with cultural traditions, social structures, and spiritual practices. His early life was immersed in a community where communal bonds, family networks, and shared responsibilities defined daily existence. Children like Oluwale were taught the skills necessary to thrive within their society, learning farming techniques, fishing practices, and the social norms that guided interactions between individuals and families. Education was both formal and informal, encompassing the transmission of oral histories, folklore, songs, and rituals that reinforced cultural identity. These formative experiences instilled in Oluwale a deep sense of belonging and a strong connection to his heritage, a foundation that would later become essential in preserving his identity amidst the horrors of enslavement. Life in his village was characterized by cooperation, interdependence, and a rich tapestry of spiritual and cultural practices. Religion and spirituality permeated every aspect of life, influencing social ceremonies, agricultural cycles and rites of passage. Oluwale participated in communal activities, learning from elders the stories of his people, the moral and ethical codes that guided behavior, and the traditions that linked generations together. These practices provided a sense of order and continuity, teaching young members of the community about resilience, honor, and responsibility. Cudjo's recollections later highlighted the profound contrast between this vibrant, interconnected life and the dehumanizing conditions he would face as a captive on the Clotilda, emphasizing what was lost through the violence of the slave trade. The capture of Oluwale Kasola was abrupt and catastrophic. His village was raided by slave traders, a terrifying event that shattered the social fabric and left individuals traumatized. Families were torn apart, and communities were devastated by the sudden removal of men, women, and children. The psychological shock of being seized by strangers, the fear of the unknown, and the brutal violence accompanying these raids created a profound sense of helplessness. For Oluwale, the violent disruption of his familiar world marked the end of childhood innocence and the beginning of a lifelong struggle for survival. The trauma of this initial capture would remain vivid in his memory, influencing his understanding of violence, power, and human cruelty. Following capture, Oluwale and other villagers were forced on a march to the coast, a journey that tested physical endurance and mental fortitude. These marches were designed to subdue captives, prevent rebellion, and prepare them for the Middle Passage. Along the way, captives were subjected to harsh treatment, including beatings, deprivation of food and water, and the constant threat of death for any perceived disobedience. The landscape that was once familiar and comforting became a hostile environment, amplifying the fear and uncertainty of the captives. For Oluwale, each step away from home was a step into a world of violence and oppression, a stark transformation from the communal and secure life he had once known. Upon reaching the coast, Oluwale was confined in a slave barracoon, a holding facility where captives awaited transport to the Americas. These spaces were crowded, unsanitary, and heavily guarded, emphasizing the dehumanization of those in prison. In the barracoons, captives faced starvation, disease, and the constant psychological strain of confinement. Families were often separated further, reducing the possibility of mutual support and deepening the sense of isolation. Cudjo Lewis later described these experiences in detail, capturing the fear, despair, and physical suffering endured by captives during this phase of the transatlantic slave trade. The barracoons were the final place where captives' identities were systematically suppressed, preparing them for the brutal voyage ahead while attempting to erode the cultural and personal connections that had sustained them. The journey across the Atlantic aboard the Clotilda represented the apex of this trauma. The Middle Passage was an inhumane ordeal, with captives packed tightly into the hold, shackled, and given minimal food and water. Sanitation was virtually non-existent, and the spread of disease was rapid, causing the deaths of many. Cudjo Lewis's survival of this journey was remarkable, and his recollections provided insight into the strategies captives used to endure both physical deprivation and psychological terror. He described the suffocating heat, the smell of human waste, and the constant fear of violence from the crew as part of the daily reality aboard the ship. Despite these conditions, captives often attempted to maintain cultural practices, singing songs or sharing stories as a means of psychological resistance and communal solidarity. These acts of resilience, small but significant, underscored the human capacity to preserve identity and dignity even in extreme circumstances. Upon arrival in Mobile, Alabama, Cudjo Lewis was sold to a plantation owner, entering the system of bondage that would define his adult life. The transition from Africa to the American South was not simply a geographical one, it involved a profound shift in social, cultural, and personal reality. On the plantation, enslaved people faced relentless labor, violence, and strict hierarchies designed to maximize control and minimize autonomy. Cudjo had to adapt quickly, learning the routines of plantation work, navigating the threats posed by overseers, and finding ways to maintain personal and cultural identity in an environment designed to suppress both. His African upbringing, knowledge of communal structures, and spiritual practices provided psychological tools that helped him endure these harsh conditions. Cudjo Lewis's African heritage remained central to his identity, influencing the ways he interacted with fellow enslaved people and later with the communities he helped establish. Memories of his homeland, language, and cultural rituals were preserved through storytelling and communal activities, serving as a source of strength and continuity. These cultural ties allowed him and other Clotilda survivors to retain a sense of self that slavery sought to erase, creating a foundation upon which post-emancipation communities like Africatown could be built. The preservation of African culture in Africatown reflected a conscious effort to maintain heritage and identity despite the disruption of forced migration and decades of oppression. In his later years, Cudjo Lewis shared detailed recollections of African life with journalists, anthropologists, and historians. These accounts provided invaluable insight into the social,
economic and spiritual practices of his community before capture. He described the organization of villages, the roles of elders and families, agricultural practices, and the rituals that marked important life events. His storytelling emphasized the richness of African culture, countering narratives that had sought to portray enslaved people as lacking civilization or sophistication. By documenting these memories, Cudjo Lewis contributed to a more complete understanding of the transatlantic slave trade, highlighting not only its brutality but also the depth and complexity of the cultures that were disrupted by it. Cudjo's recollections also shed light on the personal dimensions of displacement and loss. He spoke of family members left behind, friends lost during capture, and the emotional toll of witnessing the suffering of others. These narratives highlighted the human cost of slavery, emphasizing the emotional and psychological trauma alongside the physical hardships endured. Through his storytelling, Cudjo Lewis conveyed the profound resilience required to survive such experiences while preserving a sense of identity and dignity. His accounts offer both historical evidence and moral insight, illustrating the enduring human capacity to resist dehumanization through memory, culture, and communal bonds. The significance of Cudjo Lewis's memories extends beyond historical document. They serve as a bridge between African heritage and the lived experience of slavery in America, demonstrating how cultural identity can survive even under extreme oppression. His recollections highlight the continuity of tradition, the importance of memory, and the ways in which enslaved Africans maintained a sense of self despite efforts to erase. By preserving these memories, Cudjo ensured that the story of African life prior to enslavement would not be lost, providing future generations with a nuanced understanding of the cultural richness, resilience, and humanity of those who endured the transatlantic slave trade. After surviving decades of enslavement and witnessing the horrors of the Clotilda voyage, Cudjo Lewis emerged as a remarkable figure who bridged two worlds, the Africa he was born into and the American South where he endured bondage. His experiences illustrate the intersection of memory, culture, and survival, highlighting both the individual and collective resilience of those who lived through the transatlantic slave trade. One of the most compelling aspects of Cudjo's life was his ability to retain and transmit the cultural knowledge of his homeland, ensuring that the rich traditions, social structures, and spiritual practices of West Africa were preserved despite the systematic efforts to erase them during slavery. These preserved memories became central to the identity of Africatown, the community he helped establish after emancipation, and serve as invaluable testimony for historians seeking to understand both African societies and the human impact of the slave trade. Cudjo Lewis's recollections of African life emphasized the interconnectedness of his village community and the social norms that governed daily existence. In his early life, communal responsibility and mutual support were central values, shaping how families, neighbors, and elders interact. Children were educated in practical skills such as farming, fishing, and craftsmanship, while also learning cultural traditions, oral histories, and moral codes that guided behavior. These lessons were embedded in daily life, transmitted through storytelling, song, and ritual. Cudjo's vivid memories of these practices underscored the richness and complexity of African societies, providing insight into systems of governance, social cohesion, and cultural expression that slavery sought to obliterate. The trauma of capture and forced migration was a dramatic rupture in this cultural continuity. Cudjo Lewis and other villagers were seized by slave traders during violent raids, separating families and destroying community. The experience of capture, the march to the coast, and confinement in slave barracoons were deliberately dehumanizing, designed to instill fear, weaken resistance, and prepare captives for the Middle Passage. Yet even in these conditions, Cudjo's memories of African customs and social organization provided a psychological anchor. They offered a sense of identity and continuity that he could carry into captivity, helping him maintain resilience in the face of relentless oppression. The Middle Passage itself was a crucible of suffering and endurance. Aboard the Clotilda, captives were packed tightly into the ship's hold, shackled and subjected to extreme deprivation, disease, and violence. Many perished along the voyage, while survivors witnessed unspeakable suffering around them. Cudjo's recollections of this journey emphasized both the physical horrors and the mental and emotional strategies used to endure them. He described how captives relied on memory, song, and small acts of communal support to sustain hope and maintain a sense of humanity. Even in the most brutal circumstances, these practices preserved cultural knowledge and reinforced connections between individuals who shared a common origin, creating a fragile but essential sense of community in the face of extreme adversity. Upon arrival in Mobile, Alabama, Cudjo Lewis was sold into plantation slavery, entering a system designed to exploit, control, and dehumanize. Plantation life was characterized by long hours of grueling labor, harsh punishments, and rigid hierarchies that dictated every aspect of daily existence. Cudjo had to navigate this new environment while attempting to preserve elements of his identity and heritage. His understanding of social organization, learned in his African village, helped him build relationships with other enslaved people and establish networks of mutual support. These relationships were essential for survival, providing both practical assistance and psychological reinforcement. Cudjo's ability to maintain these bonds illustrates how cultural knowledge and communal memory were leveraged to endure oppression. Despite the relentless demands of slavery, Cudjo Lewis continued to retain knowledge of African rituals, language and spiritual practices. He shared stories, songs and prayers with fellow captives, reinforcing cultural identity and providing continuity amidst the chaos of enslavement. These acts were subtle forms of resistance, asserting the value of human life and heritage in a system that sought to erase both. Over time, this preservation of culture became foundational to Africatown, the community established by Clotilda's survivors after emancipation. In Africatown, African traditions were adapted and maintained, creating a space where cultural continuity could survive and thrive. Cudjo's leadership in transmitting these practices ensured that younger generations remained connected to their heritage, even as they navigated the complexities of post-emancipation life. Cudjo's storytelling was also critical in shaping the broader historical understanding of the transatlantic slave trade. In the 1920s, he provided interviews to journalists and anthropologists, most notably Zora Neale Hurston, recounting his experiences from capture to freedom. These narratives offered unprecedented insight into African life, the brutality of enslavement and the resilience of those who endured it. His testimony was distinguished by its richness of detail, emotional depth, and commitment to preserving memory. Unlike official records or second-hand accounts, Cudjo's recollections conveyed the lived experience of slavery, highlighting both suffering and the strategies of endurance employed by those enslaved. By giving voice to these experiences, he contributed to the historical record in ways that would influence generations of scholars and educators. The preservation of African identity in Africatown was not merely cultural, it was also a form of social and political autonomy. By establishing their own community, Cudjo and other Clotilda survivors created a space where they could govern themselves, make collective decisions, and maintain social structures reminiscent of their homeland. Streets were named, social norms were enforced and communal rituals were practiced, reflecting the influence of African village life. This autonomy was both practical and symbolic, asserting the capacity of formerly enslaved people to self-organize and preserve their heritage despite systemic barrier. Africatown became a living testament to resilience, demonstrating that the legacy of slavery could be met with creativity, agency and cultural continuity. Cudjo Lewis's narrative also emphasizes the psychological resilience required to survive and thrive after emancipation. Life in freedom was fraught with new challenges, including economic hardship, racial discrimination, and the task of rebuilding community in a society structured to marginalize African Americans. Yet Cudjo's ability to draw upon memories of African social cohesion, moral guidance and spiritual practices, provided the foundation for navigating these challenges. His leadership in Africatown and his dedication to storytelling exemplify how cultural memory can be leveraged to create both psychological stability and communal solidarity. The importance of Cudjo Lewis's recollections extends to their role in education and public memory. By preserving first-hand accounts of the transatlantic slave trade, African life and plantation slavery, he provided a human perspective that challenges abstract or sanitized historical narrative. His stories illuminate the personal dimensions of slavery, fear, loss, resilience and hope, making the past tangible for audiences who might otherwise struggle to grasp its reality. Moreover, his accounts highlight the endurance of African culture in the Americas, demonstrating how enslaved people and their descendants preserved identity, traditions and social cohesion in the face of systemic oppression. Cudjo's life also illustrates the broader historical and cultural impact of the Clotilda survivors. By maintaining African traditions and establishing Africatown, he and others created a lasting legacy that continues to inform our understanding of African heritage in the United States. Their experiences underscore the resilience of cultural memory, showing how traditions can survive displacement, trauma, and systemic efforts at erasure. Cudjo Lewis, through his memories, leadership and storytelling, ensured that the human dimension of slavery, the vibrancy of African life, and the enduring strength of those who survived would not be forgotten. The integration of memory, culture and resilience in Cudjo Lewis's story offers a model for understanding the transatlantic slave trade as both a human tragedy and a testament to survival. His recollections reveal the continuity of identity across continents and centuries, demonstrating how cultural knowledge, social cohesion and personal agency enabled formerly enslaved people to endure profound trauma and build meaningful lives in freedom. By transmitting these experiences to future generations, Cudjo ensured that the lessons of the past, the vibrancy of African heritage, and the resilience of enslaved people would remain central to historical understanding and collective memory. Cudjo Lewis's life after emancipation was marked by both the challenges of adapting to freedom and the remarkable efforts to preserve cultural identity, memory and community. Emancipation brought legal liberation, but it did not automatically guarantee safety, security or economic stability. For Cudjo and other Clotilda survivors, freedom meant navigating a society still structured by racial prejudice, economic exploitation and social exclusion. The transition from enslavement to self-determination required resilience, ingenuity and the ability to reconstruct a sense of community from the fragments left behind by decades of forced labor, displacement and violence. Cudjo Lewis's story illuminates the profound complexity of this post-emancipation period, revealing both the hardships and the remarkable agency of formerly enslaved people in shaping their own destiny. One of the most significant undertakings by Cudjo Lewis and his fellow Clotilda survivors was the creation of Africatown, a self-sustaining community near Moby, Alabama. Africatown was more than a residential area. It was an intentional effort to preserve African traditions, social structures and communal bonds in a new land. For Cudjo, the foundation of Africatown reflected a deep desire to maintain connections to his homeland, honor the memories of those lost, and provide a space where survival, culture and identity could coexist. The establishment of Africatown required not only vision but also practical skills, purchasing land, constructing homes, cultivating crops and creating social institutions, all while navigating a society that often sought to marginalize African Americans. The determination to create such a community exemplifies the resilience and resourcefulness of Cudjo and his peers. Africatown also served as a living repository of memory and history. The residents, many of whom were survivors of the Clotilda, shared stories of capture, the Middle Passage, and life in Africa. These narratives reinforced a collective identity and provided younger generations with knowledge of their heritage. Cudjo Lewis, as one of the elders and primary storytellers, played a central role in transmitting cultural memory. His recollections of African social structures, rituals, language, and daily life ensured that the community retained a sense of continuity despite the profound disruption caused by slavery. Storytelling within Africatown was both educational and therapeutic, providing opportunities for reflection, communal support, and the preservation of dignity in the aftermath of trauma. The psychological impact of slavery and the transition to freedom was profound, and Cudjo Lewis's life illustrates the long-term consequences of this experience. Emancipation did not erase the scars left by decades of brutality, forced labor and family separation. Survivors had to confront grief, loss and the challenge of rebuilding relationships in a society that offered limited opportunities for justice or recompense. For Cudjo, survival required not only physical endurance, but also the cultivation of mental and emotional resilience. His ability to maintain a strong sense of identity, preserve cultural knowledge, and lead within Africatown reflects a sophisticated understanding of both personal and communal strategies for coping with trauma. This resilience became a model for others in the community and contributed to the stability and cohesion of Africatown itself. Cudjo Lewis's storytelling, particularly in the interviews he gave in the 1920s, provided an invaluable contribution to historical scholarship. He described in detail the capture of his village, the march to the coast, the horrors of the Middle Passage aboard the Clotilda, and the brutality of plantation life. Unlike official records or second-hand accounts, his narratives offered a deeply human perspective, conveying the emotions, fears, and strategies of survival that statistics and documents could not capture. These testimonies became crucial for understanding the lived experience of slavery and the resilience required to endure it. Cudjo's recollections also highlighted the continuity of African culture in America, demonstrating that enslaved people and their descendants retained elements of language, religion and social organization despite systemic attempts at erasure. Africatown exemplified the practical application of cultural continuity. Residents drew upon African knowledge to organize labor, manage communal resources, and maintain social cohesion. Practices related to agriculture, food preparation and communal decision-making reflected traditions adapted from their homeland. Social rituals, storytelling and spiritual practices reinforced identity and collective memory, allowing residents to navigate life in a society that often denied them recognition and autonomy. Cudjo Lewis's leadership ensured that these practices were not only preserved, but actively transmitted to younger generations, providing a foundation for cultural survival long after the immediate experience of enslavement had ended. The creation and maintenance of Africatown also illustrate broader themes of agency and self-determination among formerly enslaved people. By establishing their own community, Cudjo and others asserted control over their lives, governance, and social organization. This autonomy was both practical, allowing them to manage land, resources and labor, and symbolic, representing a reclamation of identity and dignity after decades of oppression. Africatown became a space where residents could exercise freedom in meaningful ways, make collective decisions, and maintain social structures reminiscent of their African heritage. In doing so, they challenged the societal constraints of the Jim Crow era, and asserted the enduring strength of African cultural traditions in the Americas. Cudjo Lewis's personal resilience was complemented by his ability to foster community cohesion. Within Africatown, he provided guidance, shared knowledge, and mediated social interactions, helping to ensure that communal bonds remained strong despite external pressure. His leadership was informed by the organizational structures he remembered from his African village, demonstrating how pre-enslavement cultural knowledge could be adapted to new contexts. These efforts reinforced social stability, cultural continuity, and the transmission of memory, illustrating the ways in which formerly enslaved individuals actively shaped their post-emancipation environment, rather than passively accepting imposed circumstance. The historical significance of Cudjo Lewis extends beyond Africatown. His detailed recollections provided a rare first-hand account of the Clotilda, the last documented slave ship to bring Africans illegally to the United States. By documenting his experiences decades after emancipation, he preserved, not only personal memory, but also critical historical evidence of illegal slavery practices, the brutality of the Middle Passage, and the lived realities of plantation life. These accounts offer scholars and the public a direct connection to the human dimensions of slavery, enriching our understanding of both the transatlantic slave trade and its enduring impact on African American community. Cudjo's narratives also emphasize the moral and emotional dimensions of slavery, highlighting the ways in which human beings endured suffering while preserving dignity, culture, and community. He recounted the strategies captives used to survive the Middle Passage, maintain cultural practices under enslavement, and establish meaningful relationships in the face of dehumanization. These narratives challenge simplified or abstract understandings of slavery, providing a vivid, nuanced, and empathetic account of human resilience and ingenuity. By sharing these stories, Cudjo Lewis transformed personal memory into a collective historical resource, ensuring that the experiences of the Clotilda survivors would inform future generations. Cudjo's life illustrates the intersection of personal survival, cultural preservation, and communal leadership. He endured extraordinary hardships, yet he leveraged memory, knowledge, and social cohesion to create a lasting impact on his community and on the broader historical record. Africatown became both a refuge and a living testament to the resilience of African heritage in America, demonstrating that culture, identity, and memory could survive forced migration and systemic oppression. Cudjo Lewis's ability to retain and transmit this knowledge underscores the importance of storytelling and community in preserving history and fostering resilience after trauma. Through his interviews and leadership, Cudjo Lewis ensured that the experiences of the Clotilda survivors were not forgotten. He provided a living link between Africa and the Americas, between slavery and freedom, and between past trauma and future cultural continuity. His recollections offered scholars, journalists, and the general public an unparalleled window into the human dimensions of slavery, enriching historical understanding and preserving the voices of those who endured the transatlantic slave trade. By recounting his life, Cudjo Lewis demonstrated that memory, culture, and resilience are essential tools for survival, identity, and communal continuity, providing a model for understanding the enduring impact of slavery on individuals and communities alike.
Cudjo Lewis's later years were marked by reflection, storytelling, and the preservation of memory, providing an extraordinary window into both the horrors of slavery and the resilience of those who survived it. Living in Africatown, a community he helped establish alongside other Clotilda survivors, Cudjo became not only a leader and elder but also a custodian of history, preserving the stories of his homeland, the Middle Passage, and decades of life in bondage. His recollections, particularly those recorded in the 1920s, offered a rare first-hand perspective of events that had long been obscured by official documents, hearsay, or historical omission. In recounting his experiences, Cudjo Lewis illuminated the human dimensions of slavery, demonstrating how memory, culture, and communal bonds could survive even the most brutal attempts at erasure. After decades of enslavement, Cudjo's transition to freedom was fraught with challenges. Legal emancipation did not automatically translate into security, economic opportunity, or social recognition. The societal structures of the post-Civil War South were still deeply discriminatory, limiting access to land, education, and employment for African Americans. For Cudjo and his fellow Clotilda survivors, survival in this new context required resilience, resourcefulness, and the ability to construct social networks that could provide mutual support and preserve cultural identity. Africa Town represented the tangible manifestation of these efforts, a community where African traditions, social cohesion and shared memory could flourish despite systemic obstacles. Africa Town was more than a settlement, it was a living archive of memory, culture and resilience. Cudjo Lewis played a central role in shaping this community, guiding social norms, transmitting knowledge, and ensuring that African heritage remained a cornerstone of daily life. Streets, homes, and communal spaces were organized to foster both practical living and cultural continuity, reflecting social structures reminiscent of the villages he had known in Africa. In this way, Africa Town became both a refuge and a statement, a declaration that formerly enslaved people could maintain identity, govern themselves and create cohesive communities despite decades of dehumanization. Central to Cudjo's role in Africa Town was the transmission of African cultural knowledge. He retained vivid memories of village life, social hierarchies, spiritual practices and communal responsibilities from his homeland. These memories informed the social organization of Africa Town and guided younger generations in preserving traditions that might otherwise have been lost. Storytelling was the primary vehicle for this cultural transmission. Through narratives of pre-capture life, the Middle Passage and plantation slavery, Cudjo not only educated his community but also affirmed the dignity and resilience of its members. His recollections emphasized moral lessons, survival strategies and the importance of communal solidarity, reinforcing both identity and social cohesion. Cudjo Lewis's first-hand accounts also provided crucial historical evidence. As one of the last surviving survivors of the Clotilda, he offered unparalleled insight into the final chapter of the transatlantic slave trade. He described in vivid detail the capture of his village, the march to the coast, the horrors of the Middle Passage, and the harsh realities of plantation life in Alabama. These recollections went beyond statistics or economic records, revealing the emotional and psychological dimensions of enslavement. His narratives highlighted the fear, grief, and trauma experienced by captives, as well as the resilience, ingenuity and social bonds that allowed them to endure. By recording these memories decades after emancipation, Cudjo ensured that the human realities of slavery would not be lost to history. The significance of Cudjo Lewis's storytelling extended beyond historical documentation. It provided a counter-narrative to prevailing myths and sanitized accounts of slavery that often omitted the experiences and voices of the enslaved. His testimony emphasized agency, resilience, and cultural continuity, demonstrating that enslaved people were not passive victims, but active participants in preserving identity and community under extreme conditions. This perspective was essential in reshaping public understanding of slavery, highlighting both the brutality of the system and the enduring strength of those who survived it. Cudjo's voice became a bridge between the past and present, connecting contemporary audiences to a lived history that might otherwise have been obscured. In addition to cultural and historical preservation, Cudjo's role in Africa Town encompassed practical leadership. Survivors had to manage land, build homes, cultivate crops, and create communal structures for governance and mutual aid. Cudjo's experience both as a survivor of the Clotilda and as someone familiar with African social organization enabled him to contribute to the community's functionality and resilience. His guidance helped ensure that Africa Town could support its residents materially, socially and culturally. This practical leadership complemented his role as a storyteller, illustrating the ways in which survival required both organizational skill and the preservation of memory. Cudjo Lewis also addressed the psychological and emotional aftermath of slavery. He recounted the trauma of family separations, the violence endured during captivity, and the constant struggle to maintain identity under oppression. These narratives served as both testimony and instruction, teaching subsequent generations about the costs of slavery and the strategies for endurance. His reflections highlighted the importance of resilience, community support, and the preservation of cultural memory as tools for coping with the legacy of oppression. In this way, Cudjo's life demonstrated that survival extended beyond physical endurance. It required emotional intelligence, moral fortitude, and the capacity to transmit knowledge to others. The interviews and writings that preserved Cudjo Lewis's recollections were groundbreaking for their time. Conducted in the 1920s by journalists and anthropologists, they captured his voice, memories and cultural knowledge at a moment when first-hand survivors of the Clotilda were vanished. These records provided insight into African life before capture, the transatlantic slave trade, and the realities of plantation slavery, offering a richness of detail unmatched by official documents. His narratives preserved not only factual accounts but also the emotional depth, moral reflection, and cultural context that brought history to life. Scholars, educators, and the public gained access to a humanized and deeply nuanced understanding of slavery, illuminating the experiences of those who endured it and the resilience they displayed. Cudjo Lewis's legacy is inseparable from the preservation of African culture in the Americas. Through Africa Town and his storytelling, he ensured that the customs, language and social structures of his homeland survived in a transformed context. Songs, rituals, communal practices and moral teachings were maintained, creating continuity between pre-capture life in Africa and life in post-emancipation Alabama. This preservation of cultural identity was a form of resistance against centuries of dehumanization, affirming the dignity and humanity of enslaved people and their descendants. Cudjo's efforts demonstrated the enduring power of memory and tradition as tools for resilience, survival and communal cohesion. The broader historical significance of Cudjo Lewis lies in his ability to link multiple generations, geographies and experience. He connected Africa and America, slavery and freedom, trauma and resilience, past and present. His recollections provide insight into the transatlantic slave trade, the lived realities of plantation life and the post-emancipation challenges faced by formerly enslaved people. They also illustrate the capacity for agency, community building and cultural preservation even under extreme adversity. By sharing his life story, Cudjo Lewis ensured that the experiences of the Clotilda survivors, their African heritage, and their resilience would inform historical memory and contemporary understanding. Cudjo Lewis's life stands as a testament to the human capacity for endurance, adaptation, and preservation of identity. Through Africa Town, storytelling and leadership, he bridged the gap between the lost world of Africa and the American South, creating a legacy that continues to educate and inspire. His recollections preserved the memory of the Clotilda and the resilience of its survivors, providing a living link to a history that might otherwise have been forgotten. In recounting the horrors of slavery and the triumphs of survival, Cudjo Lewis transformed personal memory into a collective historical resource, ensuring that the lessons of the past, the endurance of culture and the human capacity for resilience would remain central to the understanding of American and African diasporic history. Cudjo Lewis's life stands as one of the most extraordinary testaments to human endurance, resilience, and the power of memory. From the vibrant villages of West Africa to the horrific confines of the Clotilda, from decades of enslavement in Alabama to the creation of Africa Town, his story is a bridge between worlds, centuries and experience. He survived the unspeakable brutality of the transatlantic slave trade, endured the dehumanization of plantation life and yet preserved the richness of his African heritage, passing it on to subsequent generations. His ability to retain cultural identity, lead a community and transmit memory ensured that the experiences of those who endured slavery would not vanish with time, but would instead illuminate the human spirit for generations to come. Cudjo Lewis did not merely survive, he bore witness. His storytelling transformed personal trauma into collective history, allowing the world to see the human cost of slavery in its most intimate, visceral and emotional form. Through Africa Town, he provided a living testament to resilience, creating a space where culture, community and memory intertwine to form a sanctuary of survival. He reminded the world that freedom is not just the absence of chains, but the reclamation of identity, the restoration of dignity and the persistence of hope against overwhelming odds. The legacy of Cudjo Lewis is multifaceted. It is historical, cultural and profoundly human. It challenges us to confront the brutality of slavery, to honor the resilience of its survivors, and to recognize the enduring importance of memory, storytelling and community. His life exemplifies the power of human agency, the capacity to endure unimaginable suffering, and the ability to transform trauma into a foundation for future generations. Ultimately, Cudjo Lewis's story is a reminder that history is not merely dates and documents, it is lived experience, carried forward through memory, culture and resilience. The world he left behind, embodied in Africa Town, in his stories and in the memories of his descendants, continues to speak across time, demanding that we remember, honor. In celebrating his life, we celebrate the indomitable strength of the human spirit, and the enduring power of hope, survival and cultural preservation even in the face of history's darkest chapter. Cudjo Lewis remains more than a survivor, he is a beacon, a bridge, and a living legacy, ensuring that the true story of slavery, survival and resilience will never be forgotten.